Video showing Erika Kirk, widow of slain conservative leader Charlie Kirk, embracing US Vice President JD Vance as at a public event.
Something shifted online over the past few weeks.
I am tremendously blessed and honored.
What started as a passing clip on social media gradually turned into a full-scale cultural spectacle.
Well, this image has ignited widespread speculation online.
The kind where people stop scrolling and start investigating.
And why has it done so well? Speaking in an interview about the media restrictions to quote the proceedings of Tyler Robinson, the very man accused of killing her husband.
At the center of it stood Senator JD Vance, his wife Usha Vance, and Erika Kirk, the widow of conservative media figure Charlie Kirk. It all began quietly enough, but like most stories in the digital era, it needed only one moment to ignite. And once it did, it refused to die down. The moment happened at a Turning Point USA event. The setup was the same as dozens of similar gatherings: speeches, applause, stage lights, photo ops. But when Erika greeted JD on stage, the hug between them was noticeably long. Not dramatic, not scandalous by definition, but it lingered in a way that made people look twice. Some viewers saw warmth, others saw something more intimate than expected. The internet didn't merely notice, it dissected. Clips replayed in slow motion, screenshots circulated, camera zooms focused entirely on Erika's expression. Then came the commentary accounts, the lip readers, and the Reddit threads analyzing the energy between them. Within 24 hours, hashtags pairing their names trended across platforms. The reaction was not subtle. People weren't just watching, they were interpreting.
Tonight, to be able to introduce to you a very, very dear friend and his wife. They are incredible.
Public speculation escalated further when Erika, speaking later during the event, drew comparisons between JD and her late husband, Charlie. Her tone was emotional, heartfelt, and vulnerable. To her, it may have been a tribute. To the audience, already buzzing with curiosity, it sounded like confirmation of something deeper. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about a hug. It was about intent, grief, admiration, and boundaries. Meanwhile, Usha Vance stayed silent. No statements, no posts, no gestures signaling where she stood. And the silence, as always, spoke louder than words. Reports began emerging from people claiming to know the couple, suggesting Usha felt blindsided by the wave of attention and uncomfortable with how JD and Erika's interactions were being framed. Whether those claims were accurate or exaggerated, they spread quickly, fueling the narrative even further. Then came the interviews. Not JD's, Erika's. She began appearing on podcasts discussing rebuilding, resilience, and forming new connections after loss. For many listeners, these were understandable reflections from someone navigating grief, but for others, especially those now hyper-focused on the dynamic between her and JD, the timing felt loaded. Online commentators didn't need evidence, the story was doing all the work. By the time rumors began circulating about Usha considering separation, the situation had crossed from a viral moment into something resembling a serialized drama. And just when the speculation reached a boiling point, JD finally responded. Not through a public statement, but through a cautious, measured remark during a radio interview, a remark that raised more questions than it answered. When JD finally addressed the situation, his tone was controlled, deliberate, almost rehearsed. He didn't mention Erika's name, nor did he directly reference any rumors. Instead, he spoke broadly about how public life can twist ordinary moments into narratives that have little resemblance to reality. He emphasized that his priority was his family, not the noise. It was the type of response politicians often rely on.
Erika said her life has been under constant public scrutiny. She added that ever since, cameras have captured her every move, every smile, and every tear. They should also be allowed to record what happens inside the courtroom.
Calm enough to appear level-headed, vague enough to avoid further entanglement, polished enough to sound responsible. But the internet doesn't appreciate subtlety. The public wanted clarity, and what they got was ambiguity. For some, that was enough to assume innocence. For others, the refusal to say more looked like dodging. Social platforms split into factions: those who defended him, those who mocked him, and those who felt a deep empathy toward Usha. The story evolved into something more emotional than political. People weren't just reacting to a public figure, they were projecting personal experiences, insecurities, and beliefs about marriage, loyalty, and public vulnerability. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly. Erika, who had been highly visible online for months, sharing reflections on grief, faith, and rebuilding, suddenly went offline. Her account stopped updating. No inspirational captions, no podcast teasers, no behind-the-scenes photos. It was like someone hit a switch. And in the world of internet scandal, silence is rarely interpreted as peace. Silence is considered strategy. Commentators speculated that her team might have advised her to pull back until the situation settled. Others suggested she was overwhelmed and simply needed space. Some assumed she was preparing to speak, and that when she did, her version of events might differ sharply from the public assumptions being formed. The truth was impossible to know, but the speculation became its own kind of fuel. At the same time, reports began circulating that Usha had taken legal steps toward separation, possibly even filing divorce papers quietly in Ohio. None of this had been officially confirmed, but the rumor took on a life of its own. Screenshots of anonymous tips spread rapidly. Political blogs began posting headlines about marriage turmoil, shifting alliances, and personal crisis behind the scenes. And whether accurate or not, the story had momentum. Momentum that didn't rely on truth to continue moving. What made the situation even more volatile was JD's position. He wasn't just any public figure, he was a rising conservative figure with national ambitions. His image had always been grounded in family values, faith, and stability. The idea of dissonance between public messaging and private life is particularly damaging to that kind of brand.
And I see no one will ever replace my husband. No. But I do see some similarities of my husband in JD and Vice President JD Vance. I do.
The more the story spread, the more political analysts began discussing not the scandal itself, but its impact. Because in politics, perception doesn't just influence reputation, it influences power. And at this moment, the perception of JD Vance was shifting rapidly, uncontrollably, and publicly. As the story intensified, something unexpected happened. The internet began to paint Usha as the emotional center of the narrative. Clips of her from past campaign events re-emerged. Her quiet posture beside JD, her measured smiles, the way she tended to stay in the background. These harmless moments, once overlooked, were now framed with somber music and captions about sacrifice and silent strength. Entire TikTok edits portrayed her as the composed, loyal spouse who suddenly found herself at the center of a storm she never asked for. This wasn't just gossip anymore, it had taken on the shape of a public empathy wave. Commentators said Usha looked like someone who had been carrying more than she expressed. Others argued this narrative was projection, romanticizing a real human being into a character archetype. But that didn't matter online. The emotional tone was set. In the eyes of thousands, Usha had become the heroine in a story she didn't write. And this shift had serious implications, because when the public emotionally sides with one figure, the others can quickly be cast into roles they may not deserve: the suspected betrayer, the opportunist, the disruptor. This wasn't about innocence or guilt, it was about story shape. The internet loves a narrative with clear lines, and it began drawing them with startling speed. Meanwhile, JD's political allies were unusually quiet. Normally, when a narrative threatens a rising public figure, you see a coordinated wave of statements, tweets, and interviews pushing a counterstory. But days passed without notable defense, no talking heads affirming JD's character, no religious leaders offering supportive commentary, no friendly media figures running interference, and the silence felt intentional, like a wait-and-see pause from people evaluating how deep this story might go. A strategist quoted in one political newsletter put it bluntly, "Donors don't mind controversy, they mind unpredictability."
And that's why I'm so blessed to be able to introduce him tonight, because he understands the fight that we're up against.
If a figure can't control the narrative, it raises questions about whether they can withstand pressure under higher stakes. And JD's public image, once grounded and methodical, now appeared reactive and strained. At the same time, speculation grew around Erika. Her sudden retreat from social media only fueled imagination. Some believed she was preparing a controlled, carefully staged interview. Others believed she was avoiding further scrutiny out of emotional exhaustion. Some argued this was strategic damage control. The truth could have been any of those, or none. But the absence of clarity meant the narrative expanded without her. And then there was the element that made this story uniquely volatile: grief. Erika had lost her husband not long before this. Public grief is heavy enough. Public grief under constant commentary is nearly impossible to navigate cleanly. Any emotional expression could be interpreted as vulnerability, resilience, manipulation, or symbolism, depending on who is watching. The internet wasn't just debating whether something had happened between Erica and JD, it was debating how grief should look, how healing should manifest, and where the line between connection and boundary lies. These are questions that don't have definitive answers, but the internet isn't interested in nuance. The internet is interested in conclusions, and once an audience believes a conclusion, it rarely lets go.
And he can articulate that in a way that transcends race, that transcends demographic backgrounds. He's an amazing man.
While the emotional narrative gained momentum online, the political stakes began to sharpen behind the scenes. JD Vance's public identity had always leaned heavily on the values of loyalty, rootedness, and family stability. His rise in conservative politics was fueled, in part, by the image of a man who had overcome a complicated upbringing and built a grounded home life. So when the internet started questioning the stability of that home, it wasn't just tabloid drama, it struck at the core of his brand. Political operatives understand that perception is currency. If voters believe a leader is steady, principled, and consistent, they will project stability onto their decisions. But if doubt creeps into the personal storyline, even quietly, it can alter the way people interpret every move afterward. Analysts began to comment on that shift. Even small outlets started publishing opinion pieces questioning JD's judgment, his discretion, and the company he keeps. The narrative of family man was starting to feel uncertain, not because of confirmed wrongdoing, but because the question was now being asked. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that Usha had spent time away from Washington, possibly returning to Ohio with their children for support. These claims were unverified, but they aligned with what people already felt, and in digital culture, feeling often outweighs fact. The idea of distance, emotional or physical, amplified the tension of the situation. And then attention turned back to Erica, whose silence continued to stretch. Her absence was becoming its own form of presence. Commentators analyzed every earlier interview she had given, looking for tone and implication. Clips were reframed, language reinterpreted. Her grief journey, already deeply public, was now being re-narrated through the lens of speculation. Some saw her as vulnerable and unfairly targeted, others saw ambition or blurred boundaries. The conflict wasn't about facts, it was about the uncertainty surrounding her intentions. Through all of this, JD remained measured in tone. He maintained the position that public perception does not reflect private truth, but the more he tried to separate those worlds, the more people fixated on the idea that maybe the two weren't separate at all. When a public figure says, "ignore the noise," it can sometimes have the opposite effect. The audience begins to wonder, if there's nothing to hide, why not confront it directly? Political commentators began discussing whether JD's response was strategic patience or miscalculated restraint. Some argued that addressing rumors directly only inflames them. Others insisted that failing to do so allowed the rumors to shape themselves. Both sides agreed on one thing: the longer the narrative remained unresolved, the more control shifted to the public. And in the age of social media, once the public holds the narrative, it rarely returns to the original source. At this point, the situation was no longer simply about JD and Erica. It was about the story now being told, a story that millions were participating in, shaping, reacting to, and spreading. And the story was gaining speed, complexity, and emotional investment with each passing day. As the situation continued to unfold, the story reached a point where it was no longer about any single moment, gesture, or phrase. It had evolved into something broader, a reflection of how modern public life operates, especially for figures caught between politics, media, and personal vulnerability. The internet had effectively turned JD Vance, Usha Vance, and Erika Kirk into characters in a shared cultural narrative. And once a story reaches that stage, it takes on a life beyond the individuals inside it. The speculation surrounding Usha's next steps became the emotional anchor driving online engagement. Every day she remained silent. The assumptions grew stronger. Silence, in the digital age, is often interpreted not as patience or privacy, but as confirmation. Whether that interpretation is fair or not doesn't change its influence. When people feel emotionally invested in a public figure, they begin to script outcomes, imagining breakups, reconciliations, confrontations, or dramatic statements that may never come. Meanwhile, rumors began emerging that Erica might eventually sit down for a high-visibility interview, a chance to speak in her own words about grief, misunderstanding, and the weight of public scrutiny. If such an interview does happen, it will almost certainly reignite the conversation, because Erica's story carries emotional resonance, a young widow navigating life while the world watches her every move. But depending on what she says, or doesn't say, It could shift the narrative in unpredictable directions. Sympathy can return just as quickly as suspicion can resurface. JD, on the other hand, now finds himself in a delicate position. Every decision he makes going forward will be read through the lens of this moment. Public appearances will be analyzed. Statements will be scrutinized. Supporters and critics alike will be watching for signs of clarity or weakness. For a politician with long-term ambitions, this kind of sustained narrative pressure is more than inconvenient. It can shape perceptions that linger for years. Because in politics, stories don't have to be proven to become defining. They only have to feel believable. That's the quiet truth beneath this entire situation. There may be no affair, there may be no betrayal, there may be nothing here beyond grief, human connection, misinterpreted body language, and the public's appetite for drama. Or there may be deeper truths that have not yet surfaced. But the reality doesn't matter as much as the story the public chooses to believe. And right now, the story being told is one of blurred lines between public and private, between support and intimacy, between grief and attachment, between perception and reality. Where this goes next depends on decisions made behind closed doors, decisions no audience will witness. JD and Usha may reconcile privately, strengthen their family, and weather the storm. They may separate quietly, with dignity and restraint. Erica may return to public life with clarity and compassion, or she may step away for good. But what's undeniable is that this moment has shifted the way people see JD Vance. The image that once appeared unwavering now has complexity, vulnerability, and controversy attached to it. And in the digital era, images rarely return to what they were before. Sometimes the narrative doesn't end. It simply changes shape.